1, 2, 3, 4.
Thanks for downloading the Scuba Confidential podcast. Welcome back, everybody.
We're back.
Hey.
It's episode 14. Yep. We're back in the studio with a few things to talk about. With me are my good friends Ian.
Hello.
And Louise.
Hello.
We're going to have a little chat about what we've been up to. We've got Lou with the news on orcas and shipwrecks. And we've got a subject item to talk about. As usual, there's a theme to what we're talking about. Believe it or not, there is method to our madness. So we've got a subject that was voted for by listeners, and we'll get to that in a little while. So for me, I don't know what you guys have been up to. For me, I've been in the classroom coaching some new open water students. And it's been really nice, actually, as the season kicks off, to get back in talking about some of these concepts. Because even though, obviously, I've taught a few courses in my time, to go back over it after a few months' break, it's nice to get, dust off my fins and get back into the groove in the classroom. So that's nice. In addition to that, there's a couple of new instructors who've started working with the particular school I work with. And it's been nice to work alongside them and just, not that they need much in the way of instruction, but just to kind of help them and team teach with them and see them develop. And Jim and Ellie, if you're listening, do really, really well, and really talented instructors who are making big strides at the moment now, teaching with students.
That's going to be fun having them in the water up at Stony this year.
I think so. I think it's going to be good, and there'll be a lot of students who'll be very lucky to have them teaching them. I think they're really developing nicely as instructors.
Jim was my dive master when I started.
Was he? It's his fault, is it?
It was, actually. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, Jim. It's all your fault. All your fault.
What have you guys been up to?
So I've been working in the dive centre over the past few weeks, and yeah, it's picking up steadily. So it's getting a lot busier. We're getting a lot of people coming in to do their open water courses, leading up to the warmer months, which is really good. And yeah, it's been pretty busy actually. I was in the shop yesterday for a few hours, and it was pretty full on, which is great. And we're getting lots of junior divers coming through as well. So lots of SEAL teams and bubble makers starting at the moment, which is always really nice to see.
Excellent stuff. Ian?
Well, I've got my medical coming up in a few weeks' time. So the last few weeks I've just been concentrating on my fitness and diet and stuff
good
like
on
that.
you.
With focus on that. Had a really great workout and fitness classes yesterday. So that was really good. And so apart from that, that's about it really, to sort of just focus on that at the moment.
Yeah, that's good. We've got to practice what we preach, and we talk about fitness. We talk the talk. We've got to walk the walk, isn't it? That's the phrase.
Is it?
Oh, well, maybe I've just made that up.
I think you just made that up.
It's gone a little bit Alan Partridge there. Well, we are in Norwich. There was one other thing I was going to mention in that sometimes people write to us, which is really nice. And this week we were really pleasantly surprised to receive a nice email from a chap called Josh Collins, who's based in Sydney, Australia.
Hi, Josh.
Hi, Josh. G'day.
G'day.
Crocodile Dundee in the corner.
That's
over
me.
There. And it was just a really nice email. He just sent us out of the blue. And I don't want this to turn into Steve Wright's Sunday love songs where it's like, thanks for, love the show, Steve, every 10 minutes. But it was really nice to have an email out of the blue from one of the listeners just saying how much he likes it and thanking us for what we're up to, because as we will say, we just do this for fun, it's not like we're taking a salary to come in and do this. So it's really nice people out there appreciate it, and thanks Josh. Josh is about to begin some diver training. We wish him luck with what he's going to do out there in Sydney. So there we go.
Oh, and also we had a note from another one of our listeners, Matt, who said after hearing our show, episode 13 on fitness, that he's looking getting into the gym, getting fit, ready for his starting his diving this season. So that was really good. Nice to hear from him.
Yeah, people listen to us. That's
two.
That's two people.
That's two people
We're
now.
Inspiring people. Isn't it amazing?
Careful, we're teetering on the brink of using the J word again here.
Oh, yeah.
All right,
We're
steady
on
on.
a journey, Marcus.
Shall we move on? I think we'll crack on. It's time for Lou with the news.
So public views are to be sought regarding new protection statuses for shipwrecks in Scotland. It marks the centenary of the scuttling of the German High Seas Fleet in Scapa Flow. Basically, Historic Environment Scotland, or HES, which advises the Scottish Government on historic marine protected areas, has launched a double consultation suggesting that it recognises and protects the world-famous wrecks in Scapa Flow and also the Queen of Sweden wreck off of Shetland. You worked in Scapa a couple of seasons, haven't you, Marcus?
Yeah.
You're familiar with the area. Basically, a spokesperson for the HES has said a change to the historic marine protected area designations is a more appropriate way of managing the region's history. And they said that Orkney has one of the most outstanding collections of First and Second World War naval wreckage remains, both above and under the water. And they're really trying to drive that forward, that protected status, really.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's something quite close to my heart. As you said, Lou, I've no pun intended, I got a bit of history with Scapa Flow. I did 4 seasons there, so sort of 4 years living up there in Orkney and teaching diving and guiding divers and taking people on little history tours around there and that kind of thing. So if people out there, if Sarah or Ben or Emily or Big Al and Andy, my old skippers, are listening, hello to you guys. Scapa Flow, for those who don't know it, perhaps you're from another part of the world, is probably, for us up here in the Northern Hemisphere, the most famous wreck diving site. It's famous for lots of reasons, but the kind of the biggest reason, or the most famous and iconic part of Scapa Flow, is the fact that there were some wrecks that were scuttled there, deliberately scuttled, at the end of World War One. So as part of the armistice agreement at the end of World War One in 1919, Germany had to surrender most of its fleet. A total of 74 ships, German High Seas Fleet, arrived in Scapa Flow for internment. And there was sort of a miscommunication. There's lots of stories about how and why, and perhaps we'll do a separate episode on Scapa Flow, and I can bore everyone with Scapa Flow stories. But essentially, the Admiral von Reuter, who was in charge of the fleet up there, had then instructed his various captains to scuttle the fleet. And there's some kind of various stories as to how that happened. And a total of 52 ships went to the sea floor. This remains the greatest loss of shipping ever recorded in a single day, even to this day. Of those, only a handful remain. I think it's really vital that these are protected. These are absolutely critical.
Because weren't the in the 70s salvaged quite heavily, like these wrecks?
Absolutely. So the wreck salvage operation. The thing is, it's a bit like the way I always try and I like using an analogy quite a lot. You think of like cars; they reach a certain age, and everyone thinks, "Oh, they're useless, they're worth nothing." If you hang on to that car for another 20 years, suddenly they become a classic.
Because they're big boats, weren't they? Because they are the dreadnought era, weren't they?
Yeah. So just to come back to that analogy, with the history of the wrecks and when they sank, then people didn't see them as worth a great deal. They didn't see them as worth anything in historic terms because they weren't. It was recent history. It was like It was a boat that sunk 10, 20, 30 years ago, and it would be like owning an old Ford Escort that was, had gone round the clock. People didn't think that it was worth anything in particular, but now they've become these massive historic monuments and need to be protected because of that. Now, what happened was in the 60s and 70s, there were big salvage operations. So I used to take people around the various wrecks, and for example, if you went on the wreck of the Colne, there was a big blast hole in the centre of it where they would go in and go for the valuable items that were held within the confines of the hull, because the metals and the various
copper and stuff like that.
Yeah, a lot of the materials that were used on the wrecks were of high value, so there was a huge salvage business there in those periods. And now it's gone the other way, where they should be protected. They are a part of our history as a country and just generally.
Well, you've got the Royal Oak up there as well.
Yeah, I mean that's a different. That's a war grave, but that's a different story. That's World War II, and I could go off into a story about Winston Churchill and the barriers and the Italian soldiers that were held up there, and that's sort of a subject for another day. We're in danger of going off topic here, but I think it is massively important.
The general area, according to the HES survey, was said to show a hugely diverse range of archaeological material, both in and on the seabed, and that, like any other archaeological sites, the fragile heritage is prone to deterioration and decay. So, it's exposed to the elements, like you say, the barriers.
You've got various islands that it crosses to.
Yeah.
I mean, the barriers I won't go into too much detail to, but they were put there off the back of the Royal Oak incident. They were built to stop enemy vessels getting in to wreak havoc.
Barriers, weren't they?
Yeah, the Churchill barriers. So they were instructed to be built by Winston Churchill. He wasn't Prime Minister at the time. He was First Lord of the Admiralty. And that came off the back of the Royal Oak incident, which is a whole other story I could tell you about the submarine captain and how they came in and managed to sink the ship.
U-47.
So that's probably a story for another day. But yeah.
They're quite exposed though, aren't they, the barriers?
They are exposed, yeah.
It's quite an unforgiving environment, isn't it? Especially during the winter months, I'd imagine.
Very much so.
So any protection for all these areas, both in and on the water, are absolutely crucial, I
think so, yeah.
And I suppose another good reason to look after them is for the ecology side of things. Is that obviously they're now marine life living on these wrecks, and that should all be protected as well.
Like most vessels or shipwrecks that have sank, they do become like a natural, an artificial reef.
Yeah.
And for example, if you're diving around the bow of one of these ships, they're covered in anemones and dead men's fingers and all sorts of sort of soft corals.
Dead men's fingers.
Yes. I've opened a can of worms here with Ian talking about Scapa, haven't I? I should have had this brief news item is turning into an epic where I teach him about Scapa Flow.
Someone's left their fingers there.
It's a type of wildlife.
Yeah.
We'll put a picture up on social media for you, Ian. Anyway,
But going
Louise.
back to speaking as divers, there's no suggestion that either of the proposed designations would affect standard don't look but don't touch recreational diving activities. So the same rules would apply to divers.
Yeah.
So even with an extra protection status for them.
I think that's really good.
Good.
That's a good thing. And we'll have a separate. Perhaps we'll put it to the vote. Perhaps we'll have a separate Scapa Flow episode at some point for people who are interested. Okay, what else you got, Lou?
Next up, marine biologists have obtained DNA samples from what they believe to be ultra-rare Type D orcas off of southern Chile. It is thought the discovery of the samples could provide some hope of a new species new to science.
Wow.
Which is pretty exciting.
Yeah.
So basically, after photographs of similar orcas were taken in the southern Indian Ocean in 2005, tissue samples were taken from the strandings 50 years earlier. So there's basically strandings of these rare orcas earlier on. And the orcas had more bulbous heads, and they were narrower, and they had more pointed dorsal fins and tiny white eye patches compared to other species of orcas. Okay. So there's many different species of orcas. Back in 1955, 17 of the strange-looking orcas were stranded on a beach in New Zealand. But at the time, scientists just thought that this was due to a genetic aberration. Genetic aberration.
Oh, right.
I think
brace yourself.
Brace up. Ian's just learned another new word.
I thought an apparition was a ghost.
No, that's an apparition.
Yeah.
An aberration means
Close.
something odd, an idiosyncrasy.
Right.
We're down the rabbit hole now, aren't we?
We are.
So we come back from the English lesson back to orca.
Leave that. Basically, taking into account images from sightings reported in the Southern Ocean, scientists posited the existence of a separate species in a separate scientific paper. Basically suggested that Type D orcas had diverged genetically from other species some 400,000 years ago.
Amazing.
It's pretty cool stuff.
Yeah. And a lot of these species are ancient, sharks and orcas, and their family tree stretches back far further than ours. I mean, as humans, I think most evolutionary biologists say we've been around as a species about 200,000 years. So
didn't they find the first humans in Africa? Aren't we all meant to go back to Africa or somewhere?
Absolutely, yeah. Orcas, love them. Have you guys ever been lucky enough to see one in the wild? I have a couple of times, but I think they're amazing creatures. And as it happens, I've got some orca facts.
Really?
Yeah. So I found these. This is the Live Science website, facts about killer whales in orcas. Orcas weigh up to 6 tons.
Blimey.
So 5,443 kilograms, and grow up to 23 to 32 feet long, which is 7 to 9.5 meters. And that's basically the length of a bus. The largest orca ever recorded was 32 feet, which is 9.8 metres, a whisker under 10 metres, which is huge.
Yeah.
Absolutely incredible creature. In terms of their diet, orcas are apex predators, and which means they're at the top of the... I could see Ian's face. Apex predator.
No, I remember this from the earlier podcast. We were talking about great whites.
Yeah, so that means they're at the top of the food chain, that they have no predator. They are king of the castle, essentially. And they feed on seabirds, squid, octopus, sea turtles, sharks, rays, and fish. So they are the daddies of the ocean.
They're pretty badass, aren't they?
Yeah. There's always this. It sounds like something that would happen in the playground. What would win in a fight between a great white and an orca? And the answer is an orca. They are known to be the most aggressive apex predator,
really?
and probably one of the most intelligent ones. In terms of their offspring, a female killer whale can give birth every 3 to 10 years to one offspring at a time. And there'll be women listening to this who will cringe at this, but the calves are about 8.5 feet, 2.6 metres long.
Ouch.
And weigh up to 120 to 160 kilos at birth. So, yeah, that's a fairly sizable offspring.
Yeah.
You're going to notice when that gets through.
But, yeah, that's good. That's going to make your eyes water. But without wanting to show off, I've been lucky enough to see orcas actually in Scapa Flow, as it happens. They came up and alongside the boat and were inquisitive. And at the time, just as I remember, Big Al, the captain, was 2 mentions for Big Al today. Big Al. He realised what was going on and just put the ship we were on into neutral, wound back the throttle, and we just sat there mid-water, just floating with the tide, and just these things circled the boat. These orcas circled the boat.
They came in quite close.
They came in close. They were literally brushing the side of it's a converted fishing trawler we used as a dive boat up there, and they were sort of brushing the side of it. My friend Ellis, who works for the BBC as a cameraman, got some amazing photos of them. So what I'll do is, when this episode goes out, I'll put some of those photos out and give Ellis a little shout.
Because they have been seen in the Farne Islands as well, haven't they?
Well, they're all over the world. You
Yeah.
can find them. They can survive in most environments. They're pretty adaptable in those terms. So there you go, orca.
Yeah.
Excellent stuff.
Excellent.
Any more with the news, Lou?
No.
That's
done.
All done with the
All
news.
done.
Thanks for that. Brilliant. Okay, so
You done well on some of the pronunciations as well. There's some good old words there.
what was the word again, Ian?
And that.
the irony.
Irony alarm.
Deliberate slip.
A deliberate. We're gonna let Ian off his little slip up there with his pronunciation of the word pronunciation, ironically, because it's a bit of a special occasion.
Is it?
It is a special occasion, and for all of you guys listening, there's a little bit of an announcement today. It's going to be a bit different when the podcast goes out, but right now today it's Ian's birthday. Everyone, the king of Bungay, the Peter Pan of diving,
Nearly 30.
nearly 30. We won't reveal his real age because, much like Cliff Richard, he likes to keep it a closely guarded secret.
27.
But we do have.
It's okay.
We couldn't let the occasion pass without mentioning it on the podcast. And I think Louise is leaving her chair now, listeners, because there's.
Where are you going?
She's running off around the corner of the
Come
studio
back.
where we've got a drum kit stashed, strangely, to go and get something.
So is this the birthday edition then? Is it the podcast?
The birthday edition, the King of Bungay.
Oh my goodness, we've got cake.
Hey!
Oh, awesome.
in the house.
Oh, I love it. Excellent. We have cake.
birthday.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So for those, obviously you can't
Got
see
cake.
this, guys, listening, but we have a little cake with Ian's face on it and a pair of sunglasses.
That's very nice. I like
An
it.
emoji
It's emoji.
cake.
It's a cool emoji.
So we'll take a shot of that and post it, and as soon as we
Nice
finish
one.
recording this, we'll have a slice. But I don't think you need to hear us munching down the microphone as we're recording the podcast. So we'll save that for after the episode. But yeah, happy birthday, mate.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
That's
Thank
all
you.
right.
We
And,
love a bit of cake, don't we?
had
we
a
do
nice-
like a bit of cake.
We had a nice curry last night. That was nice, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
we did go out.
good.
We put our kind of fitness regime on pause for a
Just
couple
for
of
last
hours.
night.
and went out for a curry, some poppadoms, which was really nice. Moving on to the main subject of today, for those who don't know, we have a Patreon page, and if you haven't seen it, why not? Go to patreon.com/Scuba Confidential, or you can get involved with the podcast and have a say in what we do. And that's exactly what we did with this week's episode. We put a vote out there for people who follow the podcast to get involved, and we put up basically 5 different subjects that we would potentially talk about on this episode. And it was quite overwhelming, actually. We had over 50% voted for the subject of the buddy system, benefits and flaws. So it's obviously something quite close to people, quite something they're interested in, something they've had experiences both good and bad with the buddy system, and it's something I thought we would talk about on this episode.
Yeah, and I just want to say, for people listening, make sure you do, when you do listen to us, that don't forget to leave us a review and rate us. That all helps. Anything where you listen to us, either it's on Acast or iTunes.
Or iCast and iTunes even.
Yeah, but yeah, absolutely. Don't forget to leave us a review and rate us.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
It's a free way of supporting us.
Absolutely. Yeah, agreed. It all helps. So this week we're going to talk about the buddy system. It's one of those things. It's a bit of a sacred thing in diving, and if you're critical of the buddy system, it causes uproar. And if you defend it, it causes uproar. It's really controversial like that. The buddy system has been a cornerstone of recreational diving since recreational diving came to the fore, really. It's sort of in the late 60s when PADI, SSI and some of these major agencies, BZAC sort of predates that a wee bit, I think. And it's been a cornerstone of diving for good reason. Across the globe, new open water divers learn to make pre-dive safety checks in buddy pairs, practice descents and ascents in buddy pairs, learn their initial air sharing drills in buddy pairs. And this procedure's evolved for many reasons, but there are potential flaws in the system. It's not perfect. It's not broken, but it's not perfect. And we want to just have a quick look at some of those issues, both the pros and cons, just have an open discussion about it. I thought it might be quite an interesting thing to do.
So I was searching on the internet, and one of the things I
You're
found...
searching on the internet. What words
just
did you
happened
type?
to be looking on the internet, and I happened to find that the YMCA was involved in setting up the buddy system.
That's
in
right.
the early days.
The village people.
And them. Apparently one was
policeman
well,
or
one
the
was
Red
dressed.
Indian or...
One was dressed as an Indian. One was dressed as a policeman.
Very good. Well, thanks for that.
That's all right.
In fact, when you do instructor training, there is crossover with some of the courses, and there are courses within the YMCA where you can do dive training, where it crosses over into different things. Ian's, for the benefit of people listening, he's now doing the YMCA dance, everyone. You're so lucky this isn't live streamed. He's still on a high from that cake, I think. But yeah, the buddy system has been a cornerstone for a long time. With lots of different agencies and organisations, it's a really important thing. And there are the sort of benefits to the buddy system. You've got logistics. So for most divers, especially a lot of novices, having a buddy to put on or help remove your gear is invaluable. If a diver's struggling with a clip, or your buddy's got an awkward fin, something like this, you can help each other, which is really useful. And certainly we see that each week. Have you guys seen that with students are struggling, or... He's just nodding. That's really useful.
We're just still on the YMCA thing. Maybe it was just designed for the young man. Young man. Sorry.
That's all right.
You've gone wrong, Ian. You've gone wrong.
Yeah, I think we'll edit that bit. I think, yeah. So there's the logistical function of it where people help each other. And of course, when people are starting out, let's say someone's doing a try dive, it's like first day at school, and either myself or Louise or Ian would dress that person. They'd get into the water. The idea is that we're fully kitted first. We're ready with our complete scuba unit on, and we then help to dress them like first day at school and show them where the clips are, zip them in, ready to go. As they progress into open water divers and beyond, the idea is that they become more self-sufficient, and at minimum they can work as a kind of equally competent buddy pair to help each other to get ready. Okay, so the logistical side of it is really key. You've got the safety side of it, and that was driven because, in part at least, because when recreational diving began, it was an era of less reliable scuba gear. So modern equipment obviously is pretty reliable. I've only had maybe one or two equipment failures in the water.
We imagine how much technology's come on with scuba gear. So imagine being a buddy system years ago. It must have been quite difficult.
Well, if you think back to the different valve systems that they had in the day, a K valve versus the J valve, if you think back to Cousteau era.
Right, hold on, back up.
This is open water
Jay-
chapter 1, Ian.
Yeah, but we've got people who might not listen, who might not be particularly divers.
Okay. All right. So K valve is a standard sort of valve we use. The J valve, the old school valve, is before there were SPGs, before there were air gauges.
Okay.
All right. So for those of you who ride motorbikes out there, who used to have had older motorbikes like me, there's no fuel gauge on them, and it was the same with old school diving.
Yeah.
So on a motorbike, my first motorbike, I used to ride along on a full tank, and when it used to start to splutter, I'd reach down.
Like that.
What? Hang on, sorry.
I had an Escort like that.
With a reserve tank.
No, just didn't know till you ran out of diesel.
Thanks for that, Ian.
Sorry.
So back to what we were talking about.
Sorry.
As you're riding along, then the bike would start to splutter, and you'd reach down with your right hand and flip there's a little lever down the side near the gearbox, and you would flip it, and it would go onto its reserve tank, and you knew you had then about another 20 miles in the tank, or 30 kilometres, and you'd then get to the fuel station. And it was the same in scuba. So coming back to where we were before we went off on the Ford Escort, then in Cousteau era, they would breathe and carry on about their dive. And when the breathing resistance used to start to go up, they would flip a lever. That meant they were at about 50 bar, give or take a wee bit. Okay, or 700 PSI, depending on how you look at it.
Before they started doing the out of air.
Well, no, they would use that as their signal to make an ascent.
Ah, okay.
That flipping of the lever, the first person who got to that stage, that would be their kind of, okay, we need to be getting out of Dodge City now and heading where we need to go to end this dive safely. So it was a different era, but modern scuba gear, of course, even the traditional single cylinder is really reliable now. The only thing is with single cylinder setups is there's no redundancy. Mm-hmm. By redundancy, what I mean is that there's nowhere to go if it goes wrong. If you do more advanced diving, if you start going down that road and you've got a twin set or you've got a pony bottle, if there's a failure, there's somewhere for you to go to. There is a bailout. There's a redundant air source. But with normal recreational equipment, there isn't that. So, of course, when we're teaching people on day one, you need to be, for example, if I'm teaching people in open water, as they do in their qualification dives, I want you to be within 2 seconds or a couple of decent fin kicks of your buddy at all times for that very reason, in case there is some sort of issue or they've misjudged their air when they leave me as qualified divers. Yeah. So that safety aspect's really key to it. Mm-hmm. And it's not just air, it's anything safety related when you're in the water. It could be someone struggling at the surface, it could be a fin's fallen off, it could be, there's sort of numerous reasons, and I'm sure you guys will have some examples of the things you have seen in the water over the years where having a buddy there, or it may have even happened to you, where a buddy has been there to help you, or you've been there to help a buddy, and it's certainly happened to me.
Oh yeah, definitely. I can think of occasions where I've either had to help my buddy and help them out the water, or when they've been in the water and they've got into trouble, and you've been there to lend them a hand and see them right.
You don't know if they're going to be taken ill underwater or on the water. We know of a few people who have sort of had funny turns underwater, and they've had to get to the surface and get to medical attention for whatever reason. And having a good strong buddy system, having an attentive buddy who you can rely on and you trust, is absolutely crucial, I think. Because if somebody isn't on the ball and somebody's kind of going off taking photographs 20 metres away, and they're not kind of paying attention to the fact that you're potentially in trouble, it can be devastating, couldn't it? So you need to trust your buddy, and I think that's why diving's a very special sport, and there's a certain kind of camaraderie with diving, is that you're investing a lot of trust in your buddy. Yeah. Because if you get in a pickle underwater, there's that kind of unspoken assumption, if you like, really, that you can rely on them to get you out of the water and get you safely to medical attention. Yeah. And you don't really get that with other hobbies, and certainly not I've encountered anyway.
No, I think because it's an alien environment being under the water, we're essentially we're not supposed to be there, are we? We're land mammals. So being down there, diving is statistically super, super safe, but you are in an alien environment. There is the potential for something very serious or potentially life-threatening to happen. Yeah. So having people alongside you who you're comfortable with, and also having the competency yourself to be able to help them is part of being a responsible diver. So I think that's really key.
But it's also as a calculated risk, though, isn't it? Because you are, well, it's a controlled risk, really, because there is risks, obviously, with diving, but you know that you're competent, or you should be competent in what your skills are with diving, and you take that on when you get in.
Yeah, I think that's the ideal, isn't it? I think it sometimes goes awry, and we'll get to that as we get further in, as we sort of, I don't want to use the phrase unpack, but as we get further into this topic, I've got a few examples, and a few listeners have written into me with some examples as well.
So I found an article on the online, and that's actually quite interesting. It's by the late Bob Halstead, who's wrote this article.
Yeah, famous diver.
He's a famous diver, done a lot of diving, and he had a blog going as well. And it's written in 2001, called Line Dancing and the Buddy System, which is an odd thing to call it, isn't it? But I think the line dancing come out because line dancing is also something that they do with buddy system, buddying as well in dancing. So anyway, his interesting point that he makes is about buddying up with really experienced divers with inexperienced divers and the issues that could come from that. Mm-hmm. And also he makes a really good point about, say, a father who's an experienced diver, the issues that could come from having a child who's maybe 13, and you take them in the sea, and what happens. There's been problems in the past where divers have gone out with that makeup. So you've got a father takes a son out, the father becomes ill. Well, the son, who's only 13, isn't strong enough or experienced enough to help them both. You know, and they've both got into trouble. Yeah. And there's been, people who have unfortunately not made it back because of that, or and he makes a good point about that. And I thought just raise that as and he also says that, maybe divers who do go into the water maybe should be solo qualified, so they're both up to speed.
So kind of training as a solo diver before then branching out into a buddy situation. Yeah,
because what you're saying is that it's good to bridge across the experiences, but what happens if the really experienced person gets into trouble? Could they both get into trouble because that really inexperienced person isn't qualified or isn't strong enough to bail them both out?
Yeah, I think it's a valid point, and in a little while, it's strange actually, because we've had a listener who's written in about that, and that kind of mismatch you can get sometimes in buddy teams, and it's certainly something I think we'll talk about in a second.
And it's difficult, especially if you're say maybe a liverboard environment where you could be mismatched, and he sort of mentions that as well.
Yeah,
it's a good article to read.
Yeah. I think it is. I think it's a really valid point. In fact, I've written a piece which is in Scuba Diver Life magazine, which talks about a similar topic, and we'll put a link to that up when we release the podcast, so people can kind of see in black and white some of the stuff we're talking about. And I think the buddy system does have really, really big merits, and I'm certainly not advocating for not having the buddy system, but I think there are certainly flaws within it. As with any organisational system, I think there's benefits and drawbacks, and that one of the ones that came up, particularly when we asked listeners about it, was that unknown quantity. We've had a listener, Mel Chilvers, hi Mel, who wrote in and said, when diving with a stranger, there can be times with more flaws than benefits, which is absolutely true. Craig Morris, who's a listener and also one of our patrons, said, as a business traveller, I'm often buddied with someone I don't know, and he said, I can tell you stories that would make your hair stand on end. And he says that when he inquired as to how one diver dives, as in talking to his buddy, the response he got was, I consider myself an aggressive diver.
Whoa, what's that?
Well, that was Craig's response. And he said, what do you mean? Do you punch fish? But anyway, this aggressive diver, in inverted commas, ended up taking and using Craig's octopus, his alternate air source, without him knowing, and just swimming along behind him, tagging onto his tank.
run out of air.
without even telling him that he'd run out of air.
Oh,
So
goodness.
that is horrendous. I mean, just as a little aside, people who extend their dives by breathing off someone else's tank, that means you've got 2 people in one tank.
Yeah.
That's asking for trouble.
Yeah.
That is asking for trouble because there's nowhere to go.
No.
There's
Yeah.
nowhere to go at that point. You've got no
It's not an
redundancy.
infinite well of air that you're sharing, is it?
Exactly. Just to give some context on that, because we were talking about Scapa Flow earlier. When I used to guide people in Scapa Flow, not the shore dives, the shallow ones, but on the bigger wrecks, I always used to wear a twin set, and it's not that my gas consumption warranted it, or the run time, the length of the dive warranted it particularly, because I was taking people on recreational dives where we were within no deco limits, no stop limits. The reason I wore the twin set was that redundancy, was that reserve of gas.
Yeah.
So I knew that if I had a problem, I've trained as a self-reliant, as a solo diver, I could then bail out, shut down a manifold and move to abort the dive in a safe manner. But also I knew I had a big reserve of gas, so that if I had someone with me who needed that air, then they had somewhere to go. So that can happen.
You always got to get home.
Always got to get home, as Ian says. Yeah, yeah. That's becoming a catchphrase for you,
It
Ian.
is.
He's learning all sorts of things today, and he's on form. We also had a message from another listener called Paul Darnborough, and I'm going to have to put a bleep in this. He said, I would like to see a podcast or 2 on the subject that really bleeps me off. First is how to act on a dive charter boat, in brackets, and in parentheses it says, and teach your kids how to respect others on the boat. So obviously he's had an incident or 2 where people's children may have upset him slightly on the boat. And the second, he says, is teaching both divers and boaters the proper use and laws regarding dive flags. And I think, it's sort of slightly off from the buddy system, but that dive flag thing crops up sometimes, and we've all, well, not all of us, but me certainly, I've had close calls where even with an SMB up, I've had Zodiacs buzzing worryingly close to me above my head when I've been bringing a group up at the end of a dive. But yeah, coming back to where we were, the unknown quantity, I can relate to what Craig said here, because often if you're a single traveller, doesn't matter who you are, if you're a recreational diver, they're going to put you with a buddy, and who that buddy is a completely unknown quantity. If you are paying for diving, who you get is going to a certain extent, is going to govern the kind of quality and fun you have on, and safety you have on that dive. Yeah. And if you're a single person travelling and on a dive trip, you just don't know. You don't know who you're going to get. What will happen is at the check-in stage, there'll be someone like me who'll try and, as a rule for me, I used to try and group people together. So if I had 2 people who were advanced open water or rescue diver, for example, who had 50 dives or 100 dives in that band, I would try and put them together. And you're kind of taking a little bit of an assumption that they'll both be of a similar level. But you never quite know with people till you get into the water. And certainly it can be a real mismatch where you have someone who's not responsible in the water, who doesn't perhaps pay attention to you, goes off, does their own thing, or has a different objective on the dive, and you can feel desperately unsafe or frustrated by the people you're with.
Speaking from the couple of trips we've done to Komodo, like you said, there's always that risk with solo travellers that you might be paired up with someone of different kind of persuasion, if you like. And the particular resort we were staying at, there was a lot of solo backpackers, and so most people upon arriving didn't really know each other. But the dive centre was great in that they put people, obviously they looked at the number of dives they had. You had to do a check dive as well before actually going out on the boat.
Vital.
And they also put people who were reasonably inexperienced, so they'd done their open water course and then they'd done, say, half a dozen dives. They made a point of putting them on a one-to-one basis with the dive guides, with the dive master, which I thought was really good.
Yeah.
And it really made, certainly talking to the customers afterwards, they felt really appreciative and really safe. They were, obviously getting stuff pointed out that other divers might not necessarily have spotted. Yeah. But it was a really nice way of doing it, I thought. And it takes the stress off the diver as well. Like you say, they know they're going to get a good dive. Yeah. And they know they can rely on their buddy.
It is difficult when you're newly qualified. There is that point when you're still developing your skills, still developing your confidence, and for most people, I remember when I was a brand new diver, you don't want to be a burden to someone who's more experienced. You want to be able to hold your own in the water and be a good buddy to people. Well, most people do, I think. Yeah. that's nice if a dive centre can do that and notice and recognise novice divers and cater to them. I think that's a nice thing to do. I certainly used to do it, and certainly on the boat I was running, I would try and group people of persuasion, was it you called it, Lou? So if they're similar...
Vegetarian?
What on earth is he on about?
Is that what you mean?
Certain qualification, you try and put them together. So if I had 4 instructors on the boat and 20 guests, and I had, say, 4 or 5 open water divers, I would take an instructor who was one of my crew, who I knew was particularly attentive and patient, and I'd say, I'm sorry, Emma, this next 5 days, you're going to be looking after the new divers. And it's not criticism of them of people. It just means they'd need special attention. Perhaps they're a little less confident, perhaps a little less skillful, and they would have a different depth limit as well. So it'd mean that you're then catering to that, and I would choose the dive sites accordingly so that it was something for everyone.
You've got to allow that, because the only way inexperienced people can get experience is by doing that, isn't it? So you've got to be able to have a chance to, even on a liveaboard, to get in and experience these things. So you do build up the experience.
And essentially guaranteeing that their experience is going to be a good one will make their confidence grow, and it will really boost their experience in general of diving, won't it?
I definitely benefited from that myself, because when I started diving, luckily enough, my friends were very experienced, and we chatted about going and do some dives, and I went in with them, and I learnt from them as well. So I was quite lucky like that, I think.
Yeah, I think it can be. But the difference is, if you think of your example, Ian, there's a very, very key difference, and there's kind of 3 aspects to this. The first bit is, in that instance, say you were then diving with Jim, who you mentioned earlier, and perhaps he was your dive master on your open water course, and he said, Ian, you're a nice chap, shall we dive together? He's making a conscious choice, and he knows you, he knows your strengths and weaknesses, because he's been involved in your training, and he's willingly going in knowing that he's going to have to, a certain extent, handhold you on those opening dives. Not literally, but figuratively.
He's friendly, though.
He's very friendly. In fact, I believe Louise's husband was sharing a hotel room with him last night. We won't go too far into that. But anyway, he knows that. He's willingly given up his time because he likes you, your mates, to kind of do that.
Yeah.
If you've just flown into Jamaica or Florida, and you're just given a random person, you've paid, say, $100 to do that dive, you're going to be slightly less pleased if you have to then babysit another diver.
I had this once. I remember I was diving, it must have been a couple of years ago, and we'd done the whole buddy check. And
where were you?
Stony Cove. I've only just qualified as a dive master, and I'd put with somebody who I hadn't met before. This is just pleasure diving. We'd done the whole buddy check, and we planned what we were going to do. He had a new twin set and new kit that he wanted to test out. First dive of the day. Let's just say he did not stick to the plan. And I remember going along thinking, what on earth are you doing? And you kind of think, well, I've got to stick to the plan because that's what we discussed. And it was quite an experience because I haven't met that guy before. Yeah. And you're thinking, oh, well, okay, you kind of allow a little bit for people doing stuff. But it was quite surprised when they start behaving in a way that you don't expect.
That's when slates come into their own.
Yeah,
you can write something down and say, I'm not happy with this. Can we
go up?
Yeah,
that's right.
I think that's right, and it's plan the dive, dive the plan.
Yeah.
So if you've paid for it and paid for a dive and you end up mismatched with someone who's not as attentive, as safe, as skillful in the water as you, it can be incredibly frustrating. Ian wants to say something again.
Well, I'm just thinking there's a whole different side to this as well that we need to think about. Is that the whole benefit of diving is it's a social sport. And the joys of the buddy system is that you are going to be going in with someone who usually you may know. It's a whole social thing. So it's a nice thing about going.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
as a buddy pair or buddy group.
It's why we're doing it, isn't it, in the first place? Because it's an enjoyable hobby.
It is, yeah. And there's a nice social side to it. It's a bit like having one of them one-zip suits and that, really.
What
the
on
dry
earth
suits.
is he on about?
Well, if you know the one you get the zip from the zip from the front, and there's only one person that can zip you in. Well, the whole point, I'd go for a zip at the back. Is that you get your buddy to zip you in? It's that whole bonding thing, isn't it? No?
Have you got some fetish about being dressed, Ian?
Yeah. Just as a little aside, the zip isn't at the back because you want someone to zip you in. The zip's at the back because it's less stressful for the zip and it helps.
But when
in the
I was looking
construction.
at my suit, you can hire the zip at the front, which you can do solo.
Man alive, where are we going with this?
But when I bought my suit, I think, well, I don't need to have that zip at the front because I'm always going to have a buddy. The whole point of diving is a social thing. I'm going to be
Unless you're a
diving
solo
with
or tech diver.
Yeah, but then I'm going to have a buddy anyway, so because I won't be going down there.
Yeah.
So I'd always get my buddy to zip me in, get nice and comfy.
Well, thanks for that little aside there, Ian. It's
Just thought I'd add that in.
brilliant.
If you're looking around to buy a dry suit.
Yeah.
Back in the room.
Back in the room. One of my 3 points I was in the middle of making there before Ian went on one of his little escapades there. You've got people diving in buddy pairs. They can help each other. And if you've paid for a dive, then yes, Ian, they can zip you in. If they've paid for the dive, it can be frustrating because you pay good money for it. You have the second aspect where people willingly will help a less experienced buddy, as you've discussed. But there's a third one people always forget, and just as a little insight into life as a dive professional working on a boat, we as instructors and guides and dive masters working on boats, I was ending up with 20 unknown quantities like this every 5 days. Every 5 days. And guaranteed a handful, a proportion, a percentage of those would be a nightmare. That's just pure statistics. It doesn't mean they're horrible people. It just means and you wouldn't know until you get them in the water. So while, I sympathise with someone like Craig who's written in, life working on a boat means you're getting that multiplied by X amount each week. And it's a rotation system, which is, so every 5 days, every time that boat goes out, at check-in, there'd be 20 new people, and you'd be thinking, what have I got this week?
Is that why a lot of people, dive guides and that, don't have much hair? Because they're constantly pulling their hair out, going, oh my God.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
a bit personal, isn't it?
Yeah.
I didn't look in his direction when I said that.
Very good. Follically challenged. So, yeah, you do get that disparity, and there's those 3 aspects to it that I think have a bearing on it. One thing I would say as well about that disparity in buddy pairs is reliance. So what can sometimes happen is, often with couples or with friends who dive regularly, one becomes the dominant buddy. So you end up with perhaps a husband and wife team where maybe, say, the wife is the experienced kind of Jill Hyneth or Miranda of the group, and the husband is an occasional diver, or vice versa. And one becomes reliant on the other. So you end up with a situation where one has to dress the other, one is checking the other, one is then dominant in the water and leading the dive, navigating the dive, deploying the SMB. And while that may work while they're together, when it comes to the point where something goes wrong or goes off plan and they're separated, or the dominant buddy then has an issue, whether it's health related or equipment related or whatever the situation is, then it all goes wrong. And my view on it is, for what it's worth, is if you're diving with someone, if, say, you're diving with your husband, your wife, your brother, whatever it happens to be, and in some parts of the world they're one and the same thing, if you happen to be diving together in a buddy team and one isn't as strong as the other, they're the person who should be developing, in my opinion. And interestingly, at the dive show I saw a talk, and they were discussing just that, where I think it was Mark Powell talking about if say Lou and I were diving together and I'm edgy about, I'm not so comfortable with deploying my SMB, I'm probably the person who should be doing it on that dive and practicing until my level is equaled out with the person, or surpassed the person I'm with, until I've achieved kind of a form of mastery of it, and then the other person practicing. But together you can raise your game in that respect. And if one person is always navigating or deploying the SMB, then it just weakens the other party.
And one thing I'd say on that, it's a bit like also clearing your mask. If you're not very good at clearing your mask, one thing to practice is clearing your mask, because it's not often you have to clear your whole flooded mask when you're diving, but if you don't practice it, then you're going to get caught out one day, and but that might just happen when your buddy needs your help.
If there's anything you're not sure about, or if you have a particular skill or area of diving, like you say, that is your kind of like Achilles heel, then it's worth practicing and paying attention to that, because it not only makes you a better diver, but like you say, it makes you a stronger buddy.
Yeah.
And another thing I would say as well, especially for maybe husband and wives who both dive, is that they have very similar kit. Because then that way it's easier to self-recognise, well, that's, where it's going to be, like maybe where the octopus is, or where somebody holds the SMB. You have the same SMB, so it's easier to understand.
I'm going to disagree with you slightly on that one, Ian.
Controversial.
I don't agree with that. I think each person should choose the individual equipment that works best for them, gives them the best comfort, and if they have a particular method that they all particular, let's take one piece of equipment in isolation. Let's say a BCD. Now, everyone likes a different style of BCD, jacket or wing. The jacket or wing that I feel comfortable in, for example, isn't going to work for Louise. Louise has got a particular type of wing that she likes to use, and it's perfectly comfortable for her.
Yeah.
I suspect Louise wouldn't be as comfortable wearing, let's say, that example of the twin set I wear in Scapa Flow with a steel backplate is not going to be as effective for Louise.
Yeah,
that doesn't mean one is a better or worse bit of equipment. It means they're just for different purposes for different people.
Yeah.
Now, getting back to the buddy system, my feeling is that your responsibility when you're diving, when you're doing your buddy checks, when you're on the boat as that pre-dive procedure, is to learn about the other person's equipment, okay, to look at it. So if I rewind back to teaching, say, a confined water dive 1, I'll go through the buddy check before they leave the surface, get in the water, okay, because that's one of the requirements if you're going down the paddy road. And then when we get to the end of that session, we're going through alternate air source drills. So at that point, I then reinforce to the students, guys, you remember earlier when we did the buddy check? Yeah? That's so when you go through the equipment check, the buddy check with your buddy, where their alternate is clipped in, how the purge button works, how it clips in and secures, how to release it, which way up it goes. This is part of that procedure of being a responsible diver. So I think I'm not an advocate for everyone wearing the same stuff. I think everyone should wear what's good for them, but make that effort to work out and discover how their buddy's equipment works in the water.
Yeah.
To be familiar with each other's kit.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's part of the game. That's part of the game. One final point on the mismatch of buddy pairs is showing some empathy for the less experienced person. Is sometimes it's intimidating for new divers. A bit like you talking about, Lou, where you'd been in Asia. It can be intimidating if, let's say, someone's put in a buddy pair with, let's say they're putting a buddy with you, Louise, and they suddenly rock up, I'm just qualified, and she's this dive master who's done hundreds of dives. They might feel intimidated by that, and that can lead to pre-dive stress for them, that they're not going to be competent in the water and lead to anxiety and these kind of things. So I think if you are buddied with a less experienced diver, for me, and particularly when I was working, of course, it would be because the people arriving would inevitably be less experienced than me because it was my job. I was doing 100 dives a month. Then it would be showing some empathy towards them and not making them feel intimidated or uncomfortable and, striding around. It's because it is a team sport, and if all you're going to do, if you do play to that, like, I'm the super experienced this and that and the other, and bigging it up and puffing your chest out, is you're going to make them feel less confident about the upcoming dive. Like, I shouldn't be diving with this with Louise because look at her logbook, compared to mine. And I think it's just showing some empathy and being a bit discreet about it.
Offering some help and guidance without appearing patronising or judgmental. I think, approaching each other with a bit of kind of compassion and understanding goes a long way, because it can be intimidating and quite daunting, especially in an environment that you've not dived before with people you don't know. There's always that paranoia that, I've got to get it right, I've got to get it right. And the focus can kind of of not being, worrying about being judged and worrying about getting it right can kind of distract you from actually paying attention to the basics and, paying attention to your safety aspects.
Yeah. So I think, that's sort of a big kind of aspect to it for me, that when you get that mismatch, if you're paying for the dive and you're in a mismatch with a buddy, that's kind of a bit of a roll of the dice. When you go to a dive centre, you never quite know what you're going to get. If that is a problem for you, what I used to say to people when they come to I'm this and I'm that, and Marcus, can you sort it for me to be with? So, well, if you're that concerned, you can pay an extra fee and have me as a private guide, and we can go 1-to-1 and go for a dive, and I'll show you the best parts of the dive site. So there are options. It's not like you're condemned to dive with whatever you're given. There's always an option, and a lot of dive masters are very happy to receive a little bonus and be a private guide for someone.
I remember last year on the liverboard that I was on every single dive, just after the dive briefing, the option was given, who wants to dive guide, things like that. And there's quite a few people took that option up, especially at the early part of the holiday. Towards the end, I suppose people were a bit more experienced about, what they were doing, and they didn't have so many, the guides weren't quite so busy, but certainly at the start of the holiday they were.
Yeah, I mean, in the Red Sea, I can't say you can do anything you want, but there's more options. In a lot of places, it's a marine park, or there are local regulations, for example, in, say, places like Similan Islands or in Malta, where there has to be a local guide involved. So there's no option on that. But the buddy is something separate to that. So who you're buddied with. And it always was for me, juggling that is a bit of a challenge. So just as a little behind-the-scenes thing, and I think a behind-the-scenes episode would be quite good at some point. Here's a little glimpse behind the curtain, folks. When I had, say, 4 instructors, including me, and 20 guests, I'd match people up as best as I could for that first dive, for that check dive. And we go to a kind of less challenging reef for them to get their eye in on that first dive, weight checks, blah-de-blah-de-blah. And we take them for, say, a 45-minute dive. I'll perhaps ask them to do a couple of easy skills just to check their competency. When we got back on the boat to have breakfast for that first dive, while the guests were having breakfast, guess what we were doing as dive guides and instructors and dive masters? We would then go into a separate room, sit down and discuss all the guests. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are their air consumption? And I used to have a whiteboard, and we would write down every guest's name, what they came back with their air, any strengths and weaknesses that they had. We would talk about them. And if I needed to swap people around within the groups, I would do that in order to alleviate that later conversation and for people's comfort, so that they would say they wouldn't have that conversation. Well, I came back with 100 bar. We had to end the dive because of that chap over there. Okay, well, we'll move him to another group. We'll nip that in the bud.
That's a good idea,
and swap them around. But the guests wouldn't know that we're saying, that person's no problem, or that person's a bit of a headache. We need to perhaps give them closer attention or move them to another group or whatever the case may be. And then part of the job of being an instructor or trip leader is to be a bit of a diplomat and go out and explain to them that actually I think you'd be more comfortable with that group over there, or that instructor would suit your diving style.
Yeah, I didn't realise that went on, so that's quite interesting.
Yeah. So I think that maybe we can explore that behind the scenes stuff on a separate episode. But yeah, that does happen.
So I was going to say, I speak to a lot of people who come in the dive centre and they've been on various holidays around the world, and you obviously ask, how was the diving? And it's quite often that people say, it was okay. And then when you press a bit further and you get into more of the conversation, it's not necessarily that the diving was disappointing, but it was who they were buddied up with.
Yeah.
It was the experience of having to dive with someone. And more often than not, it's been because, the dive guides haven't been attentive, they've not been diplomatic, they've kind of just paired people up and, in the water you go. And it's really clouded. It's interesting to see how it clouds people's general experience of the diving. Yeah. They can be going to the most amazing dive destinations in the world, and because they've been paired with somebody who, depending on the circumstances, was either a bit of a pain in the butt or, had issues in the water or for whatever reason, it's completely ruined their holiday in their eyes anyway.
Yeah. It's on the boat and in the water. If you're with the wrong group, it can be a real headache. The only other sort of point I was gonna bring up with this is there is always the option, not always in every part of the world, but in some parts of the world, where if you're solo or self-reliant trained, you are allowed to dive on your own. Now, solo diving is a whole other topic for us to discuss at some point, and it is a very interesting one. But if you do have the correct training, if you then have the redundancy, if you have the equipment and the experience to go with it, in some parts of the world they will allow you to dive solo, and that can be something really, really useful. I would advocate to anyone who is concerned about buddy pairs and this kind of thing, if you're concerned about that, doing training as a solo diver or a self-reliant diver, depending on the agency you go to, is really, really valuable, because even if you're not going to dive on your own, you will learn an enormous amount about what to do if it goes wrong, how to get yourself out of problems, and you will start thinking slightly differently. And it can be the most minor thing. Like for me, you guys know, whenever you see me go for a dive, I'm always wearing 2 computers. And that's just another one of those redundancy things.
Yeah.
That's just one small example of something I would do. But there's always options and things you'll pick up and learn that will help get you out of trouble and make you less reliant and less anxious about the person you're going to be with, because you know you have the skills to look after yourself a little bit more.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you can then just leave the person you're buddied with and just see you later, mate, I'm off on my own. But it just means you have that kind of a little bit more knowledge and experience, and you can bring that into play if you have to.
I think that's a really good point, and I think anything that makes you stronger, I think that's a really good point. I think anything that makes you a stronger and self-reliant diver in the water and more experience, I think the better.
There's only one other thing that springs to mind with the kind of mismatch of buddy pairs, and it ties in before we wrap up the episode, because we've been doing quite well here today. Before we wrap up the episode, is mismatch in strength and fitness, and I think that ties in with, firstly, last episode we put out, episode 13, where we were talking about dive fitness and preparation, and also the point you raised earlier, Ian, which was you were talking about, okay, you've got, say, father and son, or a family pair where perhaps one is younger or weaker physically than the other one, or perhaps less competent in the water. That can be a bit of an issue. But with the fitness side of it as well, if you've got one person who's physically strong and perhaps they're looking after their husband or wife or whatever the case may be, and they're the super strong competent diver, if the other person is unfit and they're kind of being brought along by the other diver, again, it's one of those ones where it's all okay until they surface and they have to tow the bigger person back to the shore.
That's right.
Or back to the boat in an emergency. Then what? If they don't have the fitness and the strength to deal with that. So if you're diving with, let's say I was diving with, when my niece is old enough, let's say I'm diving with her. If I was I would prefer it if there was a third person there.
Yeah, definitely.
In the same way as if I'm teaching a course in more challenging conditions, I would want a dive master there with me as a support for me in case something goes wrong, because the person I'm with, even though they're qualified, may not be competent to then help me in an event of a problem.
I think that's something, especially as we're now sort of at the time where people are booking holidays and trips and stuff like that. And it wasn't until I was like looking at this and I was thinking, do you know, this is a valid point. And if you are looking at booking holidays and stuff like that, and you're thinking, maybe I'll take my son dive, and say if you're going to somewhere abroad, you're going to do a sea dive. And he's not that experienced, he's maybe sort of really young, is that to consider getting a guide so you've got somebody else with you, so if you're the adult and you get in trouble, there's somebody else there to help you and to get you out of trouble.
Yeah, I think if you're gonna go down that road, there's a couple of things I'd bring to that, and again, I don't want to go too far off topic because we've been jabbering on for quite long enough, but when you go somewhere and you have a dive master, a dive guide, let's say you're diving in Bali and you have a dive guide, they're not there to save you. They have no legal responsibility to stop you. Perhaps morally they would, but they have no legal responsibility to, if you disappear somewhere or you float off to the surface. They're simply there as a pace car, essentially, and to point things out under the water. So it's a bit of a frustration sometimes when I hear people going, oh, well, I had this problem, but the dive guide didn't do this or didn't do that. The guide is purely there as a guide. That's all they're there for. If you are struggling, if your competence level isn't there, if your buoyancy is a little bit wobbly, that's your responsibility. So back on episode 1, we talked about dive briefings. You hear the briefing. If you feel you have a weakness and that dive sounds challenging to you, you have to make that call as to whether you feel competent to make that dive. And it's your decision to get in the water or not. The guide is purely there as a guide. Now, with the situation you've spoken about, Ian, if you're going somewhere, you can make it clear and pay. You can pay to have a dive master or a guide, as I said earlier, with a private guide situation. And you have to spell it out to them that we would like you there for this particular reason. And that's something different. If you've made an agreement and you've arranged a fee for that kind of service, that's something slightly different. But a guide isn't there to nanny people in the water.
So what we're saying is that if you're going to plan a trip or anything like that, get experience in, if there's skills that you need to do, maybe work on your buoyancy, things like that. There's skills that you can do to work on that. And just get more practice in before you go.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And fitness as well.
Yeah.
So, get as strong and fit as you can, particularly if you're diving somewhere in a more challenging environment where there's strong currents. Make a conscious effort to really apply yourself and train essentially for that dive destination.
Yeah, I think you're spot on because they vary so much. And just sort of ties in with what we talked about. For those who don't know about scuba reviews, refreshers, reactivates, whatever you like to call it, whatever flavour of agency you are, go back and have a listen to episode 3 where we talk about them and we go over why they're a valuable thing to do.
Yeah.
But I think we'll wrap up now on buddies, unless my buddies here today, have you got anything to add?
No, I think that's it for me.
Yeah.
Not really, I think it comes back to being a nice citizen, doesn't it? Being a bit compassionate and being considerate of people, and like you say, not going around chest beating or making out just because you've got a higher qualification than somebody doesn't necessarily make you a better diver or a better person. So it's just treating people as you like to be treated yourself, I would say.
That's very nice.
What a lovely note to end on.
Yeah, we're a nice bunch, aren't we?
Do our best. I think that's pretty much it, guys. As I said earlier, this episode, the theme of it, if you like, was decided by the listeners. So if you'd like to, you may have a voice, if you'd like to say something, if you'd like to be on the show at some point, everything's on the table. So go to patreon.com/Scuba Confidential. You can have a voice. You can also find us on Facebook, on Instagram, Twitter. Just type in Scuba Confidential and find us. Stay in contact. Let us know what you're up to. Drop us an email, scubaconfidential@gmail.com, and you can get involved.
Yeah, we always like letters and things like that. So
letters.
Yeah.
Ian has a truck pull up on a daily basis with all your fan mail, don't you?
I know.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We like letters. We're going to get one through the post with a stamp on it.
Snail mail.
Brilliant. I think we'll leave it there, shall we?
Yeah.
We'll carry on with Ian's birthday now, and we're going to eat our cake. But thank you for listening.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time on Scuba Confidential. Bye bye.
See ya.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Scuba Confidential. We really appreciate you tuning in today. We'd like to clarify that we're in no way affiliated with any agency or organisation. All opinions expressed during this podcast are our own. If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Twitter at ScubaConfident1, Instagram and Facebook at Scuba Confidential, and if you'd like to support us via Patreon, go to patreon.com/Scuba Confidential. Any contribution is really appreciated. Additionally, if you have any suggestions for topics or discussions, just let us know at scubaconfidential@gmail.com. Many thanks to Plunkett Music for the groovy tunes, and we'll catch up next time. Until then, keep diving.